Today we're talking about writing mistakes that editors pretty much always have to fix. And in this case, I mean myself, but also other editors. So hopefully by learning some of this today, you can get in front of all of that. Here's how today is going to go. You see Laura Stone there. She'll give a little wave. She's my Dean of Students for Top 3 Book Workshop and any classes we do. If you have technical questions, logistics questions, please hit her up. She is the person to ask. I want to encourage you to ask questions throughout, although I want to wait until I'm done with my little presentation before we do questions. So if you think of one at the time, just pop it in the chat or use the raise hand function. And then Laura will help me keep track once I'm done with my little spiel. Feel free to ask me as many questions as you can think of, because now is the time. Again, I probably won't be doing a free class like this again for a minute. So here's your chance to do it. If you don't know who I am, I'm AJ Harper. I was a ghostwriter for a really long time, writing specifically for personal and professional development books, prescriptive nonfiction, some memoir, teaching memoir, etc. for a good long time, for a lot of thought leaders. And I developed a methodology for writing and for editing during that time, mostly just to make sure I could do my job. And I really, in the beginning, didn't even know what I was doing because I was a playwright. That was about 18 years ago. So the methods that I'm teaching you today are absolutely doable for just about anybody, because I didn't go to college to learn this. I taught this to myself. The college classes I took were on theater. That's not helpful here. This is the methodology that I learned, that I developed over time based on what I needed to be able to edit a fantastic book. Some of what I'm talking about today is in my book, Write a Must Read, which I wrote, came out last year. And then if you also want to know a couple other things about me, in addition to ghostwriting for a lot of people I can't talk about, I do write with Mike Michalowicz. He's a business author, my great writing partner. We have book 10 coming out in January called All In. And I am also the head writing coach for Heroic Public Speaking, which I'm really proud of, that community, being part of that community. There's probably other stuff, but that's just the gist. I see a bunch of people coming in. Laura, if you just want to reiterate that I'm going to be taking questions after, but feel free to put them in the chat as you think of them so that we can make sure that we get to everything. Again, today I'm talking about writing mistakes that editors always have to fix. I'm going to do the big picture stuff. There's also little stuff we have to fix. And to be clear, let's just have a moment here to talk about editing. I am a developmental / substantive editor. This means that I help you in the beginning of your process to make sure your book idea works, but also once you have a manuscript for the big picture stuff. We're going to be talking a lot about big picture today. Then there's copy editors, and they're, where I'm helping to make sure the book works, they're helping to make sure the book is correct in terms of grammar, punctuation, spelling, formatting, consistency, la, 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 la. That's not me. You don't want to ask me that stuff. I'm probably better than the average person, but it's not anything I aspire to be. I'm not that kind of superhero, let me tell you. That said, we do have a submissions checklist that I created with some copy editor friends of mine back when I was a publisher, because we kept seeing some of the same issues. You can get that, where Laura's going to put it in the chat later today or soon. You can also get it for free on my book's website, writeamustread.com. You can download it from there. Working your way through that checklist for the nitty-gritty stuff will strengthen your manuscript. But we're not going to talk about that part today. We're going to do big picture stuff today. All right, I think that's all the little housekeeping that I wanted to share. If you missed any of it because you're just joining, definitely hit Laura up in the chat, and she will do her best to answer you. Be patient with her. We've got a big group today, so give her a chance to think things through and respond to other people. Why does it matter that you think about these these writing mistakes? Because we don't ever just want to hand a manuscript off to an editor and say, here, you make sense of this. I want you to think about this. I see my students here, they've heard me say this many times. It's like, I usually use a garden analogy, but I'm going to use a house cleaning analogy now. If the cleaner comes into your house, if you're lucky enough to have house cleaners, if they come into the house and it is a disaster zone, I'm talking like post Animal House parties going on here. There's only so much they can do. They've got an hour, right? There's only so much they can do. There's no deep cleaning. This is basically just throw everything in a garbage bag and haul it out. That's all you would have time to do. Your editor needs to be able to see what's there. And the more that you can do to get it ready for your editor to see that, the better. It's not that an editor can't help you, so-called clean up the mess, but we can only do so much at one time. So the more you can do, the better. And this goes for whatever. If you're self-published and you're working with a developmental editor you've contracted with, or you have a top-tier hybrid or a traditional book deal, that person is just a human being. They can't see it all and fix it all at the same time. And if you are working with a hybrid and a traditional publisher, you may only have 2 passes with that person. And so let's give them the best we possibly can. They don't expect it to be perfect, but they will be delighted if it's something that they can work with. They don't have to do all the garbage bag work, right? And then if you're thinking of a career as an author, I can tell you when I was a publisher, when I had an author that needed heavy lifting, editorial support, which I talked about in the last free class, and then they pitched me a new book, I would always think, oh man, that took me 2 extra months, or that person never fixed anything I asked them to fix. I had to do it. What was the likelihood of me actually saying yes to them? Unless they were selling like hotcakes, unless their book was just off the charts, I was going to be a no for me. So we do actually consider that. How is it taxing an editorial department? So if you have a goal toward maybe I want to do another book, let's just get the best manuscript we can delivered. And it doesn't have to be perfect. So I'm going to talk to you today about this stuff. I almost always have to address this, no matter what. I do want to give a little shout out, but he just went off camera. Steve, are you there? Steve Shapiro. I just have to say this. I am surprised you're here. You have been editing your book you are committed. What made you want to come today?
Because there's always something to learn. And I am now just in the process of handing the manuscript off to the publisher. And we're going through another round of developmental edits before so, I mean, it's just this, we're going to make progress, but I figured before we start moving this forward again, want some more tips. So I'm hungry.
Okay, listen, I got to give you props because you have been so committed to your editing. Do you have a buy link yet for your book?
Not yet, because it won't be out till probably mid next year.
Well, just at least put the title or in the chat for people.
Okay, great, thanks.
You have been busting it, my gosh. Okay. All right, I just have to say hi to Steve, y'all. He's been committed to editing. I can't even begin to express. All right, let's just dive in, everybody. Again, all questions are welcome. I'm going to share and do a little education, and then we're going to open up for a bunch of questions. So again, this is our last summer school class. This is me. This is the class we're talking about. Writing mistakes editors almost always have to fix. And I do really mean this. It's surprising. And as I just said, and before I launched into this, when you fix all of the manuscript issues that you're capable of fixing, then we as your editors can do our best work for you. That's what you want. You know, we need to shift our thinking from an editor is just going to come in and make it great, You make it as great as you possibly can, and then let us do our best work. This is, you hear, I call it a super rough draft. Some people call it the SFD, as coined by Anne Lamott, although not an acronym. I'm using the acronym to avoid cursing right now. That is true. The myth is then you turn that into an editor. Nuh-uh. You have a responsibility in between here. So that's what we're talking about today. Write the draft super rough form. Don't have these high expectations of having a brilliant first draft. Not realistic at all. But then let's do the work so that when you submit your draft to your editor, it's the best you can do. Get into that mindset of, let me write a super rough draft and then let me go through this editing process. I think a lot of people don't know what's involved in the editing process, how much time to budget for it, way more than you think. Today, I'm hoping to shed some light on some things that always come up for me. But again, if you look in my book, Write a Must Read, I actually detail the editing method that I created for myself to be able to, ensure the book worked. And if you follow that, you'll be surprised how easy it is for you to at least know what to do next. I'm not saying it's easy to implement, but it definitely helps you figure out what to do next. So I'm just going to run through. This always happens. I can't even think of one instance where this has not happened. And by the way, no diss on my students who are here, who are alums. It even happens with my alums. Even when I say it happens, there's something, I don't know, core message, which is the transformational, foundational truth of your book, the main message on which everything else rests. We work so hard to get it, especially in my class. It's amazing when they land on it, and then somehow it's missing from chapter 1 and maybe in other places. And I have theories about this. I think it's partly because we aren't totally confident about the message, but I also think we're just excited to write, so we forget to put it in there. So your core message is your through line. When you hear people talking about what's the through line, what's that message that underline everything, it should carry through the entire book. Do you have a clear through line? And then does most of your content tie back to or support core message? This is something that always happens. It's missing. It's not there, or it's right in the beginning and then it's nowhere else. So one thing you can do to fix this mistake that we make, and really what we're talking about here are the things we have to do fix in edits. This is not something that you have to worry about too much when you're writing. This is part of editing. Do you actually state your core message? Is it there? Do you remind people of it in places where it makes sense to? So I'm not saying, hey, let's go put your core message in the beginning of each chapter, but really think about where's a good place for me to actually remind them, this is what this is all about. This is what we're doing here. You know more than you think you know about where it goes. But by actually sitting down and intentionally thinking, okay, how many times do you, a simple way, go search in Word. Can you find your core message in your document? And if not, where can it go? Where can you reiterate it? And also, how can you tie it back? So having a clear through line doesn't just mean restating it. It also means connecting the dots. Because really, you've got this foundational truth, and then the whole book basically proves that, right? So you need to connect the dots back. This is something that always happens. I don't know why. I hope that you will make sure that you show core message throughout, okay? Editors really love that, by the way. So the other is promise. The same thing happens. So I believe that a promise needs to be something that you deliver within the confines of the book. That's my personal belief. And I think that when you have a clear promise that you can deliver to readers, then that becomes your touchstone, your guiding light. Am I doing that? Is this content getting my readers there? What else do I need? It's extremely helpful to have this. So in my class, students work hard. on the promise. Can I deliver it? Is it big enough? Is it not? Is it too big? What's realistic? How do I get there? And then I don't see the promise again. It might be in chapter 1, but it doesn't come back. So I'd love for you to always look and see, am I reiterating the promise that my book will deliver? And you can use the exact wording, or you can switch it up if you had different incarnations, but does it exist there? Are you reminding them? This is a matter of managing expectations. So very often it's just absent. It's just absent from the book when I get the manuscript. So let's not do that. Okay, this is the hardest. This is it. This is the hardest thing. And you often do need a little help with this, but I don't want you to leave it all to the experts. That's structure and sequencing. Does your content flow in a way that makes sense to your reader? That last part is key. So when we think about, is this in the right order? Did I organize this the right way? Does this make sense? We're really asking ourselves. What I want you to do is shift your thinking to, does this make sense to my reader? Based on their starting point, their knowledge, experience, problems, concerns, desires, all of it. What is going to make sense for my reader? Because sometimes they have to unlearn things before they can learn things, right? We have a tendency to take our content and group them into buckets, or I call it the silverware drawer method, where we put light content with light content. We really need to think about, what is the order in which my reader needs to experience this, read this. This isn't just about the outline in terms of high-level table of contents. This is also about, an expansive outline in terms of what's actually going in each chapter and in what order. This takes some practice. But if you can ask yourself, even if you wrote it and you aren't 100% sure it's working, or you abandoned your outline, which happens all the time, it's okay. I still want you to look at all of it and ask yourself, okay, does this make sense where it is in terms of what they already know? That's the clincher. Does it make sense in terms of what they already know? But beyond that, does it make sense in terms of what they believe? Believe is another piece. Does it make sense in terms of what they're feeling right now? And I mean right now in terms of, I'm on page 97. What's going on? Most of editing is being thoughtful, considering the reader. A mistake I see is people put all their stuff together, but they aren't really thinking about what it's like to consume it. I mean, you might have a whole chapter that has 6 complicated concepts in it. That is a whoa, okay, wait a minute, right? That's maybe too much to consume. Or maybe you have a chapter that assumes that your reader has a whole bunch of knowledge they don't have. Structure and sequencing takes some practice. This is the most time consuming. But again, if you can come back to it and ask yourself, what does my reader know? What do they believe? What do they feel? You can answer your own questions about structure and sequencing. You don't actually need someone to teach you. Again, the mistakes I see are people just grouping content together and what makes sense into buckets. And then we've got to extract that. Another thing I see about sequencing is waiting too long to get to that core message piece. So I'll see 1, 2, 3 chapters on mindset before we actually get to do anything or learn anything. I'll see a bunch of backstory, a long personal story, credentials, all that stuff before we actually get to a connecting point. Your very first job as a writer is to connect. That's number 1. If you can't connect with your reader, they aren't going to read it. If they don't think that your book, if they aren't clear, why does this book matter to me? How is this going to help me? And why are you the person who can help me? If they don't understand those things right off the bat, and I'm talking ideally first page, and it's not always credentials, by the way. You have an emotional connection with the reader that's worth more than the credentials. But if you've got to get that first, you can't wait to do it. Also, core message, that is number one in terms of chapter 1. You've got to have core message. You've got to share it right there. Don't wait till chapter 5. And you want to front load your book with the best stuff in the beginning. Don't wait. So are you giving people the gist in the beginning? This is who it's for. This is my core message. This is my promise. Here's an overview of my framework. Can you say within the first 3 chapters that you've given them the basic gist? I don't want to wait till chapter 8 to get to the good stuff. If you give me some of the good stuff in the beginning, then I'll probably read chapter 8. But if you don't, I probably won't read chapter 8. So these are some of the issues that come up in sequencing. I find that authors have too much wind up. Right? I want to say all these things before I say the actual thing. Let me make sure you know all this stuff before I give you the good stuff. Don't do that. Give them the good stuff, and then let's keep moving. So structure and sequencing takes some energy, but those are some guidelines. I'm almost always have to remind people to front load. I almost always have to ask people, does this make sense for your reader here? Again, what we're doing the whole time is considering the reader. So if you just keep coming back to that. So this is the one always, every time. Chapters that even though you might know what the takeaway was when you wrote it, you didn't actually state it. Does each chapter have a clear teaching point and takeaway, meaning an overarching teaching point? You might have others that support it, right? But what's the main deal? When I'm done reading this, what should I understand or believe? And then please, the opening section, give me a sense of what I'm about to learn. So I've got the main takeaway. Do I have a sense that that's kind of what we're covering? So an opening could be a story that shows the problem that takeaway addresses. Or the solution could be the takeaway itself. Doesn't have to be a story, but do you have an opening that clearly sets me up? What you don't want is a reader that's sort of wandering through your book. Just wandering through, waiting for you to tell them what's happening. Just tell them, right? You can be super formal. In this chapter, you will learn XYZ, or you can be super casual about it. Just give me an open that is reminiscent or a sense, it shows what that takeaway in action, either a cautionary tale or a positive outcome, or speak directly to the reader there. Let me talk to you about this. Like, for example, I'm going to pull this off the show. I vary my opens, by the way. I think that's a smart thing to do. When I talk about writing a first draft, give me just a second. The very first line about writing a super rough draft in my chapter is, it's time for you to accept it. Your first draft will not be great. That's not a story open, although I do have story opens. But you know what I'm going to talk about, right? In one line. We're going to talk about first drafts now. And that's basically the whole point of the chapter. You don't have to read anymore. I hope you do, but you don't have to read anymore because I just told you. So happens all the time where I have to direct authors, my students, what's the main takeaway for this chapter? Let me see some reference to it, some semblance of it in the open, some sense of that's coming. I just said that, chapter openings. Voice and tone. This is another big one. So a mistake I see is authors who try to sound more something. Funnier than they are, sillier than they are. A big one I see with women is sassy. It's sort of a sassy girl thing. If it's not authentic to you. I also see a lot of formality in writing that comes from thinking that that's good writing automatically. The more formal you are is good. No. It might be if it's you, but we don't want to put on any airs. We're not putting on any airs. I also see formality in writing with people who are coming from academia, people who are coming from the corporate environment, and that's totally understandable. But you need your own voice. It's very often absent. And when it is there, it's often not consistent. And I think that's just, sometimes we don't know what it is, and that's cool if you're figuring it out. But again, this is just about making a decision, thinking about it. I'm often asked, how do I find my voice? Well, there's two ways. One is through actually writing to see where you land. But also it's setting some sort of intention. In my book, I call it immutable laws and characteristics. It's the characteristics part. I personally lost my voice. 10 years of ghostwriting exclusively, not doing any writing of my own. 14 years about of being Mike Michalowicz, in addition to all the other writing I did. I had no idea anymore when I sat down to write my book. It was the hardest part. You should see some of my early drafts. Boring, or pretty much just like partly me and then partly Mike. Partly me, partly dude bro from Jersey. Not couldn't get it. Had to write it out to find it, but I also had to remember some things. I had to remember, what do people say about me all the time that I'm proud of? That's how I present in the world. You have to set the intention. So I know I'm a no BS person. I'm about realism, but I'm also really encouraging and nurturing. So it's not going to fit for me to be this sort of New York badass, right? Incidentally, I'm just a transplant. I'm originally a Minnesota girl. We're very, very nice. Very, very, very nice. Even when we don't feel like it. And in me is just a person who believes in authors. I think there's always a way. I think there's always a way. And it never bothers me when an author comes to me with a problem, something they think they failed about, something that they think they're bad at, something they're worried about. I don't care if they're in tears. That never bothers me. None of that bothers me. I just want to help. So I had to make sure that came across in addition to the realism, right? Because I don't want to say, oh yeah, no problem. Write that must read, this summer. You'll be all done, perfect, tied up with a bow. That's also not true. But I had to really think that through. What's true about me? So to give that clear voice, it isn't just about finding it mysteriously. Set some intention. So this almost always happens. I'll get a manuscript and I don't know who the person is. I don't have a sense of what their voice is. It might be a mix of formal tone and informal. It might not really seem like a person. It might just seem like a caricature. So this is a big mistake. This one's huge. And again, it's just thoughtfulness, but there's almost always missing content that would help your reader understand your message or concepts. We're worried about overwriting, and we often do. We often overwrite, but it's usually not just in one direction. It's usually overwriting and gaps. It's not usually, oh, my book is too long. I think I've gone on too much. That may be true in some areas, but very often there are gaps. So an editor is going to help you figure that out, but you can actually solve this if you just ask yourself, can my reader actually get this based on what I've shared? And the easiest way to do it is to put yourself in your reader's shoes, because you know more than you knew when you started this process. You know, you have assumptions that you've made, and those become gaps. The assumptions you've made about what your reader understands become gaps in content. And also, sometimes we think, I don't want to talk down to my reader. Isn't that obvious? So then we just leave it out. I hear so many authors, I'll correct this and I'll say, well, how do I know this? And they'll say, well, isn't that obvious? I don't want to seem like I'm just stating the obvious. Well, okay, but what if they need it? So there's an easy way around it. You can just say, I might be stating the obvious for you. For some people, this might be yesterday's news, but let me share this just in case. There are ways to get in front of those concerns we have about what we're including. But for now, take a look at your manuscript. Do you have any gaps? I guarantee you do. This I definitely see, excess and overkill. Going on and on. Sometimes we do it because if we're writing a manuscript and we aren't writing it in order, we forget that we said something earlier. Repetition that's intentional is helpful. Emphasis, reminding people, building layers of content, that's all good. But when it's not working, when you say, I once wrote an entire section for my book and then I wrote it again. And I didn't even notice it until my editor said, you wrote this twice. I'm not talking one paragraph, y'all. I wrote two full-on sections as if I completely forgot. And because I titled them differently with the section header, I thought, no problem. We missed stuff. So what are you saying that's also too much? Well, this is pretty big. We want to tell them all the things. We want to give them all the things, but that's too much for a reader to take in. So what's just enough to get them to the promise? I always have big cuts that I recommend, big cuts. And so will almost every editor you encounter. Our primary job is thinking about what's easy for the reader to consume and process. So we're going to make big cuts. You should just make them on your own as best you can. And then this one is builds on some of what I've said before about clarity and assumptions. One of your editor's main jobs is clarity, making sure you are clear. What do you mean by that? Can you simplify that? Is your writing as clear as possible? And have you made assumptions about what about your reader's knowledge? Sorry for the typo there. Circumstances or experience. So let's break that down. Knowledge, circumstances, experience. So obviously we already talked about what do they know, but maybe you've made assumptions about what they know. It could be as simple as something that you think is common knowledge in your industry or your community. Circumstances, though, are important. Have you made assumptions about what's going on with them that will make them feel left out if you don't address them? So are you assuming they have certain means? Are you assuming they have a lot of free time? Are you assuming that they have a college degree? Are you assuming that they are married? Maybe some of these things aren't relevant, but what assumptions are you making without even thinking about it that then leads them to be confused or feel left out, or maybe there's something is unclear? And then experience. That could be life experience, work experience. It could also be things like simple pop culture references. Well, everybody's seen Gone with the Wind, right? No. You know, are you making assumptions about an inside joke? Is it only inside to you in your specific community, and then the reader's going to be left out? I see this a lot. People make assumptions. There's very few people on this planet you can reference without explaining who they are. Because ultimately it leaves readers out. This happens all the time. Absolutes. I also see this. Do you leave room for other opinions and options? So is your way the way, or is it a way? Is this true, or just true in your opinion? Is there room for your reader to do things, to modify, to think differently? Can they still get value if they don't agree with you 100%? Where do you have absolutes? Now you might say, I need that absolute. So I have a core message that's an absolute. A book is not about something, a book is for someone. People will argue with me about that. That's okay, I'm fine with it. I love that. I believe it. It's all me. So that's okay if sometimes there are absolutes that you're 100%, that's it. But I've written extensively about why I will beat that drum forever. There are other absolutes we put in without thinking about it. You must do this. You have to do that. If you're going to include it, that's just the way it is. You better be sure you want it to be an absolute. But we tend to do it out of habit without thinking about it. So I'd like you to look at them. And you'll see editors come through a manuscript and try and soften that wherever possible, because it's alienating. And that comes to doubts, objections, and criticisms. This is one of the most effective tools you can use as you're editing your content to help you keep the reader on the page. One of the most effective tools you can use to keep your reader on the page. Doubts, objections, and criticisms. Really, the doubts and objections lead to criticism. But where might your reader doubt the truth of your statements? Where might your reader object to your content? And then where might your reader criticize your content? And the second part of that is, how do you get in front of it? But an editor will typically not give you the solution. An editor will typically say, point out where a reader might poke holes in your content and say, well, I don't think that's true. Well, my mom never told me that. Well, that's not possible for me. You're off your rocker if you think that I can do that. I know for a fact that's not true because I tried it. And a lot of times it's really just self-doubt. In fact, most of the time, but they don't know that because they don't think that it's possible to do what you're asking them to do. Or they just have a lot of self-worth around it, issues around it. So if you can get in front of it, then you can keep them on the page, because the more they doubt, the more that stacks up, the more likely they are to quit it. They're just going to quit the book. And they might not even say it's because of any of this. It just sort of nags at them until they don't pick it up anymore. Also, a really cool thing, unintentional bonus of paying attention to this, is your reader starts to think you're reading their mind. You know, it's not meant to be manipulative, it's meant to be helpful. But an unintentional bonus is, you know, readers will say, oh, just when I was thinking that, there you are. So an editor will come through and point out where the holes are, but they're not going to tell you how to solve it. So it's better if you actually get in front of it where you can. So for example, you might make this broad, you know, I just shared, a book is not about something, a book is for someone. So I can get in front of that if a person is saying, but what if you're just writing essays or a general manifesto about the world? You know, I would then could get in front of that if I was thinking, oh, my reader might be wondering that. I have thoughts on that, but I'm not going to share what how I would get back at that. But the point is, if you can think through doubts, objections, and criticisms, this is going to help, because your editor is I'm always having to go in and say, well, what if this is true for them? Well, what if they say the opposite? Well, how are they going to do this? Which comes to doability. Can your reader do the tasks, action steps, or exercises you ask them to do? This is, I beat this drum. Oh my gosh. I wish I could have a whole percussion section about this. We have a tendency to forget the reader most of all when we're asking them to do things. An action step, exercises, whatever it is, in the middle of the chapter, at the end of the chapter, in the appendix, whatever. We don't think, okay, number one, do they need it? That's a big one. I'm always asking when I get a manuscript, are you sure that this is going to help them help you get them to the promise? Do you really need this? And then I ask, is this doable and could you make it simpler? The first question is really important because often we include things just to include them. And it's not, you know, it's just because you are trying to think of something to include very often. If you look at a lot of books, especially prescriptive nonfiction, you'll see all of these action steps and exercises that don't, you know, I don't know how many of you actually do them. Most people don't do. So we've sort of been trained to think, okay, let me come up with something. What I really want you to do is think about what's actually helpful. And then there's the factor of, can you actually do it if you're a person with a busy schedule or a lot of kids or you don't have resources? Have you considered all those things? How can you make this the simplest possible and still have an impact? Do you have any content that might be problematic? I often have to address some of that. So you do you, have your, you know, you are entitled to say what you want, write what you want, for sure. Just keep in mind that sometimes there are consequences when people are really offended. So cursing is an example. Really think about if you need it or not. Some people are really upset by it. Think about other people, marginalized groups, different opinions. How can you stay true to who you are without adding unnecessary controversy around your book? Unless your whole book is controversy, that's a different story. But really think about that. So I always have to fix at least one thing. At least one. Do you overuse the same words or phrases? An easy way to figure that out is to look for the phrases you're having to use a lot. So in my book, it was writing, editing, draft. To go through and just do a search. How many times are you using it? Are you using it too much? A lot of phrases we use, everyone has tics. A big common tic I see is using the word actually. And pretty much get rid of that. You have a tic, I don't know what they are, but you want to get rid of unintentional repetition. I can guarantee you I have to fix it in every manuscript. And then this one is something that I don't see a lot of that I ask people to do more of, and I consider this a fix. Callbacks and connections. Do you show the reader how your content connects and builds toward the promise? This is a big one. Often I see content that's just siloed. Here's the content in this chapter, here's the content in this chapter, or even within a chapter. Here's this section, then this section, then this section, but it doesn't actually connect. It doesn't build, it's not layered. And then do you call back to content your reader has already learned, which is very effective. I'm always looking for ways that authors can do this. So you should try and find some of your own to remind them that they already learned it. I want you to remember in this process that it's layered. It's not one and done. It's not, you will be done in 4 drafts. You're going to do a piece of it at a time. That's why you want to think about all these things separately. Okay, I want to stop for questions. Do I have questions? Okay, I'm looking in the chat. Let's see. Sorry, I'm trying to catch up with the questions. Okay, Kara Beams, are you here? Kara Beams.
Whoops, I'm here.
Okay, great. Hi. So
Hi.
your question was, when there are 2 authors of a book, is there a way to each have a different voice? Yes, and tell me more about the book, Kara.
Okay, so I'm a psychologist, and my co-author is a colleague, and we did trauma groups for women for over 30 years. And we're writing a book about a certain population of women. And it's where our audience would be both therapists who work with these women and also the women themselves or anyone who's interested. But mainly it's called Paradoxical Women, Powerful Yet Vulnerable. And so it's about women who come from very difficult childhoods who turn out to be highly successful in their lives. Now, my colleague is a more academic writer than I am, and I'm a more conversational writer. Yeah, so we're trying to, she's writing some chapters, I'm writing some chapters, you know, then we'll put them together. So even something as like, if I'm telling a story about one of my clients or about myself or whatever, and I say I have to identify that I mean I, Kara, versus when she does it. So it gets complicated.
Okay, this is a complicated question, but I'm glad you asked. I would encourage the 2 of you. So are you denoting which chapter each person wrote, or are you going to be having input on each chapter so that it's
that hasn't been decided yet. That's okay. A good question.
This is really tricky.
Mm-hmm.
So my suggestion is to have one voice, which is we.
Okay.
And for you to just sit down and decide what that voice is.
Okay.
Because it's going to be pretty jarring for a reader to have a conversational tone and then formal tone, conversational, formal. I think in the writing, just go ahead and do what you need to do. But in the editing is where you're going to have to come through and make those choices.
Yes.
If you have a personal story, another way you can do it is there's the Wii Voice, which is like an omniscient narrator in this case. And then there's maybe say you want to tell a personal story and it will say, you know, in Kara's words, and then it'll just maybe be in italics or set differently. So if you really want to show the difference in the way that you communicate, you could do something like that where the bulk of the text is we, and then there's still moments where you get to shine in your own voice.
Sure. That's helpful. Thank you.
Yeah, it's going to take some, you know, it's tricky. It's super tricky.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, but decide on your characteristics that you both agree on.
Okay. Thank you.
Really good question, and good luck. That one's tough. That one's tough. Nikki says she just added a chapter to her book because there was a gap. Good. I had to do the same thing. Do you have a question around that? Or Nikki's camera's off, so I'll move past. Karen says, Karen Blue, after writing and publishing 3 books, I'm not wanting to do a 4th. I'm wondering what AJ would say about getting my messages out to my readers through a blog or podcast. Sure. Do you want to tell me more about that, Karen?
Well, my books have been about moving to and living in Mexico. And so I've got a website about that. But what I'm wanting to write about is taking risks, because that's been my whole life. And I don't think I want to do a whole other book. And if I include that blog in I won't call it travel, but in my Mexican site, is that going to be really confusing? Or should I just not do that?
So, I mean, I think it's a risk to move to Mexico. So I think you can, combine the content.
Yeah.
Have you thought about having, do you want to generate revenue from this content?
Not necessarily. That's not my big goal. My big goal is just to share my experiences and help other people overcome their objection to change and risk and things like that.
Okay, so a blog is a great place. Yeah, you don't need to do a book. You can also do little PDFs. You can have a beautifully designed PDF for one small type of content and make that available for sale or for free as a download on your site, as you feel like writing them. Okay. Let's see, Jessica. Oh, hey, Jessica. Just completed a super rough draft. What are the next 3 steps you're taking as if it was your own? Oh, what a good question. Congrats, by the way. I hope you celebrated.
Thank you. I did.
Okay, awesome. So the first thing I would do is take a break from it, probably for at least a week, if not 2 weeks, and not look at it at all.
Okay.
The second thing I would do is start on my editing passes, which are in my book. And I would start first by mapping the reader journey and making sure that the structure and sequencing was actually working. That's the very first thing that I would do. And then I would just go down the line with the passes, crossing them off as I go. Once I get through that, then I would send it to advanced readers for their feedback.
Okay. When you talk about structure and sequencing, it grabbed me because it's been like about a week and a half, 2 weeks. So I did read through 1 through 5, and I could see where there's gaps. I could see where I could elaborate more. But if it's not a chronological, well, it's a memoir, but it's not chronological. It starts really with my early adulthood. So when you had talked about grouping content, do you ever group time periods in order for it to make sense?
Sure.
Do I start there?
Is it a teaching memoir or is it a straight up memoir?
It's a memoir it's a teaching memoir. It's about my early adulthood, and it deals with alcoholism, but beyond that, it talks about transcending like the human struggle, like taking your darkest moment and turning it into like the best years of your life, that kind of thing.
So so you have actual advice that you're giving?
I'm not giving actual advice like how to do that, but I'm giving stories of myself and also others that I've witnessed and seen. It's kind of raw, authentic storytelling that has really good endings and takeaways.
Okay, let me ask it in a different way, because are you speaking directly to the reader at all?
Yes.
Okay. So you're not writing a straight up memoir. You have, it sounds like you have maybe even memoir plus, because you have other stories besides your own.
Correct.
So then I really would try and organize it around, I would try to see if you could organize it around main teaching points. Do you have a list of the teaching points that you're including?
Yeah, I mean, they're actually my title names now that I wrote like 15 years ago, but they are teaching points, they're principles, but I definitely have to they can't be chapter titles. They're not chapter titles. They're just what I wrote to 15 plus years ago. So yeah, I could elaborate on that in each chapter. Is that what you're suggesting?
No, I'm just suggesting for organizational purposes to think about which order do those principles need to come. And maybe they don't. Maybe it's like the 4 agreements and you don't have to read them in any specific order. But
okay.
I would at least ask yourself, do they need to know these things in any order?
Got it.
If they don't, then you can organize the memoir based on, you can go chronologically, but another way is to have, what's the central question? What's the main reason a person would come to it?
If they were either struggling with alcoholism or addiction, if they were looking for hope, inspiration, or if they loved like a raw document, like a raw storytelling, inside out look of something.
Okay. So I would advise you to think about what is the current storyline that it mirrors the reader's experience, and then how the past informs it. And you might write to that structure. That's another option.
Okay.
Or edit to that structure since you've completed a first draft. So an example of that is one of our alums is writing a story that has his own journey relating to his wife's illness that then fills in with the backstory of what happened. But the current journey is his own stress around it. So that there's at least a point of tension, meaning what's going to happen, right? So you don't want a memoir that just goes through in a linear fashion, but we aren't wondering what's at stake and what's going to happen. So you almost need the adult central question that we're wondering about the whole time. And then the childhood stuff fills in versus starting with it. It's not always the case. I'm also working on one right now, which absolutely starts from childhood. So I'm just giving you a couple of options to see what's going to work best. But I think it sounds like your main thing right now is structure. And it's so hard. I wish I could just say XYZ, do this, and 1 + 1 + 1. But I want you to try a couple things and see what makes sense. So don't actually move anything yet. Just play with the structure. I would get out a pen and paper, honestly, not even use a computer, and just play with what makes sense in terms of if you want a teaching point flow or if you want a story arc flow.
Okay, that's a great idea. I like that a lot. Thank you so much.
Don't mess with the manuscript yet. Just have some fun playing around with it.
Okay. Okay, great. Thank you so much. I hope that helps. Yeah, it does. Absolutely. Thank you.
Sure. Toshi, you messaged me, is there an ideal page length for prescriptive nonfiction? What do you mean page length? Do you mean the page count of the total book? No. I wish I could give you a perfect number, but the answer is no. And we're not looking at page length. Remember, Toshi, we when we're in this stage, we're just looking at word count.
Oh, word count. Okay.
Yeah.
Like what were Mike's books word count?
They vary between, I would say, 65 and 85,000 words. And that's because his second book, which was about 12 years ago, I don't even remember, The Pumpkin Plan, because they required 85,000 words, but that's changed. Shorter books are recommended now. So I think the last one we turned in was about 65.
Thanks.
Sure. Okay, Colleen, who or what kind of book support people should I work with for writing a book of fiction? Okay, Colleen, where are you?
I'm here.
Hi, how are you?
I'm good. Nice to see you.
Nice to see you. So tell me more about the book.
It's a book about enlightenment. From my point of view, it's the idea is to promote more of a a culture of being able to speak openly about enlightenment in North America and have it not be a crazy thing or a weird thing or an outlier, for it to be become more part of the regular culture, like it is in Asian cultures. So that's the purpose of it, but it's going to be a mystery book. And so the mystery book will be clicking the story along, and the characters will be going through transformations that involve enlightenment. And so I want it to be a book that people can't put down. And I realized that I've been looking at StoryGrid, which is helpful in terms of creating a structure that allows people to click along and be able to go from one moment to the next. But being able to do that is still a work in progress on my part. But I realized that it's good to have specific people in my corner, like editors, different kinds of editors. And for writing a book of fiction, it's different than writing a book of nonfiction. And so what do you recommend as support people for that?
Well, first of all, I recommend that you get very clear about the structure for mystery for the genre. That is a very specific formula which you can play with, but you still have to know it. So that's number one, is make sure you understand the mystery formula. Some genres have that. That is definitely one. I also recommend, just for your education and for inspiration and to feel close, is a magnificent podcast called, I'm going to curse now, The Shit No One Tells You About Writing.
Oh, I love that.
Have you listened to the podcast?
I have not that one.
It's fiction oriented, but you can still learn a lot, but it's primarily fiction. And they do great work on the podcast, tons of free episodes, and then once a year they actually have a series of classes. Again, this is fiction, but
so it's a series. It's a series called The Shit That No One Tells You About Writing.
Yes.
All right, thank you.
And then if you can get some trusted beta readers, so the key is you need to find them. So one of the best things you can do if you're writing genre fiction, such as romance, mystery, horror, fantasy, sci-fi, is to become part of an author community that's focused on that genre. That's absolutely essential. You should be reading the genre, connecting with other authors in the genre.
Thank you.
It's through them that you'll find beta readers. And then finally, find, in those communities, you'll find out who are the freelance editors who are actually helpful. This is hard because you need somebody who really knows the genre and isn't going to crush your soul. So that's why I want you to have an author community, because it's only through referrals that you find that out. You can't really go into it blind.
An author community in the genre. That's excellent. Thank you.
Yeah, there's tons of writing groups out there, too many to count. And there's always problems in a writing group. Just saying. There's always
of course.
People who are divas, people who there's always problems. But it's still better if you are, connected to other authors in the genre. And I also encourage you, don't be afraid to make published authors part of your writing community by supporting them, connecting with them, because what you don't want is a group of unpublished authors that just stays unpublished. Because what happens there is a lot of grievances. Just saying.
Thank you.
You're welcome. I hope that was helpful.
It was very helpful. Thank you so much.
You are so welcome. I didn't see a lot of other questions. Any other questions? about writing mistakes. So please download the submission checklist, which is the teensy stuff that we always have to fix. I will tell you that the authors who come out of my workshop, they have such an easier time in edit. So I encourage you to follow the editing pass method and the submission checklist, which these are not comprehensive, but my checklist is pretty comprehensive. Oh, thank you, Steve. Writing sprints, yes. So I want to point out before we leave, we'll finish early today, but I want to point out we do have I'm doing an editing 6-week editing class, which will meet twice a week, and it's a chance for you to take your content and follow the method that I share in the book, but I'll be teaching it as we go. It starts August 29th, and it's the first time I'm doing it. It's the beta class, so it's a good time to get in on it. I'll be teaching twice a week, 2 live classes, giving assignments and so forth for you to follow. And I'm really proud of it because there aren't a lot of classes. In fact, I don't know of one that goes through the whole nonfiction, specifically prescriptive nonfiction editing process. And this is based on my checklist. So if anybody would like to join that class, that beta class that starts August 29th, I'm giving everybody a $500 off coupon through Monday if you want to join. If you're already in my class for the fall, which is Top 3 Book Workshop, you can come for free. So that's not an issue there. I'm passionate about editing, everybody, because this is how we make the book great. So above all, I hope that you will leave time for this. Write what you need to write and then edit it to make it better. That's how the books become great. Any closing questions before we sign off? Okay, I hope this was helpful today. Download that submission checklist and work through it. If you have questions, let us know. Hope to see you in the editing class where we get into actually how do you do this? How do you make these changes? And I hope you have a great summer if I don't see you till then. Take care, everyone.